You ever notice how the headline saying that the economy is strong or that it's stable never say for whom that is true? Here's the truth. Black America is in a recession. Not heading toward, not at risk of, but in it. And we can feel it everywhere. Black unemployment is high. Black wealth is sliding back. Black businesses are closing faster than they can get loans approved. But the official reports, silent, muted, acting like we're imagining it. This isn't a feeling, though. This isn't our imagination. This is intentional. This is policy doing what it was intended to do. Sabotage Black America. This is history repeating itself with better graphics. This is what happens when the economy recovers, quote, recovers, but skips Black communities on the way. So today, I'm naming it. I'm mapping it. I'm dragging it out of the shadows and into the microphone. Because if the economists won't call it what it is, if the government, the federal government, the state, the local governments won't call it what it is, I will. I've got some explaining to do. Let's get into it. Hey everyone, welcome back for another episode of Ayana Explains It All, the podcast bridging the gap between current events and human behavior. I am your Black Muslim lady lawyer host, coming to you recorded. I'm not live. Coming to you recorded. I always want to say live for some reason. I ain't live. This is 10:17 p.m. on Saturday, April 25th. I am recording this in my little recording closet in Northeast Ohio. Ayana Explains It All is the podcast bridging the gap between current events and human behavior that is available on multiple streaming platforms, including YouTube, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Good Pods, and a whole host of others, including our flagship Spotify. Please visit us, visit me, visit the podcast on one of those streaming platforms and many more. You can also go to the show's website, www.ayanaexplainsitall.com, and get all things podcast, every episode of the podcast, actually, and all the transcripts when I remember to load them, and a blog when I remember to write it. But also show notes, ways to reach out to me, the host, if you want to be on the program. If you want me to be on your program, you can also do that. You can email me. You can rate the podcast. And you can find out ways to support the podcast. Again, this is an independent indie podcast that I do all by myself. I've got all the equipment and all the brains, and I'm just sitting here in a closet talking into a microphone. I love what I do. I love it. You guys also, you can, I should probably put this on the website too, link to the Our Vote Counts YouTube, where I have moderated dozens and dozens of town halls with political candidates who have races in the upcoming midterms for 2026. Listen, it's been exciting. I've been working with Our Vote Count since last July, and we have done, I want to say we've done nearly 200 of these. It's almost 200. We celebrated our 100th a couple months ago. We've just been tearing through these. Honestly, and all the feedback we get from candidates is that, oh my gosh, this is wonderful. This is so needed. I absolutely needed this. You guys are doing a good job. The feedback we get from the public is this is so necessary. This is needed. Giving a voice to grassroots candidates, letting people know who's running for office, educating people about voting, because we don't just talk to people about their candidacy. We also educate voters. We have videos on our social medias that educate people on early voting, primary dates, how to vote in their state, who's got what election coming up. We also do little videos for the candidates so people, if they wanted to, and if they see someone's name on a primary ballot, you know how you can look up your ballot before you go into the polls. You can go and look at the little video that we made for the candidate on the ballot, on their or platform, what they're all about. Look them up. Or you can go to our YouTube, Our Vote Counts YouTube, and you can look at their hour and a half long, sometimes, most of the time, town hall, and find out what they're all about. You gotta know what these people are about. Because listen, there's some shady people in office. There's some people who, I told you last episode, you give them your vote and they get to that door and they forget your name. They forget who got them there. They forget what do you mean? The people elected me. What do you mean? I have no idea. People, what do you mean? So you got to know who you're voting for, and all of the different races. There's some races in my district. I had no idea, and I researched them. I went to a couple of different sites to figure out what the heck this race was, and found out some interesting things about the Democrat and Republican parties in my region of Northeast Ohio. Yeah. So, listen, y'all. I've been doing a lot of reading. You guys know that I love to read about the topics that I'm talking about. When they come into my head, I have to read about it, or sometimes reading is what puts the topic into my head. But this one came from things I've been seeing on social media about the Black unemployment rate. But also I've been in them TikTok streets on TikTok Live talking on a few live panels about this issue of the Black recession. People are not calling it a recession. I'm calling it a recession because that's what this is. People are not calling it a recession. They're just saying, oh, it's high unemployment and we're losing our wealth and, there are no jobs. Okay, sounds like a recession. We're losing our homes, we're losing our jobs, we're losing our wealth. Sounds like it might be a recession. And I read a report called The State of the Dream 2026, From Regression to Signs of a Recession, by the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. This is from January 2026. Let me just read you a passage from this. It's called The State of the Dream 2026. And it covers topics such as employment and unemployment, federal employment, tax policy, entrepreneurship. It looks at broadband policies, social media policies, all of these different factors they have studied to see how Black people are doing under the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, compared to how we were doing in, say, 2024, 2025, 2022, during the Biden administration. And what they've discovered is it doesn't bode well. The Black unemployment was 7.5% in December of 2025. And it says a level that, if seen nationwide, would indicate a recession. The December 2025 unemployment data for Black youth continued a long pattern of high unemployment and strong fluctuations, with a dramatic increase from 18.6% in September to 29.8% in November, then back to 18.3% in December 2025. So even the babies have it hard. Corresponding with the increase in Black unemployment, it goes on to say, has been an overall attack on structures and institutions historically aimed at addressing racial inequality. The Trump administration has overturned historic executive orders such as LBJ's 1965 Equal Employment Opportunity Executive Order and ended more contemporary department and agency-level programs designed to address racial inequality and advance diversity. Then it goes on to say, one of the strongest victories of the mid-20th century Black freedom movement was making the federal government a leader in inclusive employment for African Americans and in monitoring for discrimination. About 60 years later, instead of aggressive leadership in dismantling structures of racial inequality, we are witnessing regressive leadership that is slashing government employment and agencies designed to address predatory economic practices that are likely to disproportionately harm Black communities. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act also entrenched permanent tax cuts for high-income and high-wealth households and corporations, reduced investment in property alleviating programs, and left support for working families stagnant or diminished. The systematic withdrawal of protections, investments, and accountability mechanisms that have historically assisted Black communities from economic shocks, combined with a substantive increase in Black unemployment, all point to 2025 as a regression and recession for African Americans. So when I refer to the Black American economy, I'm not talking about a separate formal economy like a country's GDP. I'm talking about the economic activity, the financial position, and collective market power of Black Americans within the United States economy. How money is earned, spent, saved, invested, and circulated within that population. We look at the size and purchasing power. We look at income versus wealth. We look at labor and employment patterns, business and entrepreneurship, spending patterns, and circulation. We also look at structural constraints. Why it's discussed as a separate economy is to highlight internal economic dynamics, measure group-level inequality, argue for targeted policy or investment, and examine whether Black Americans function as a labor force, a consumer class, or a self-sustaining economic bloc. Right now, the evidence points to stronger consumer power, but limited control over production, capital, and infrastructure. The Black American economy, in sum, is best understood as a large and influential consumer economy embedded within the United States, but constrained by historical and structural barriers to wealth accumulation, ownership, and capital access. For instance, the estimated buying power of Black Americans is somewhere in the trillions of dollars. If it were a standalone country, the amount of spending power in the Black economy would rank among the top economies globally. But that figure can be misleading without context. It reflects spending power, not wealth or economic security. So let's look at income versus wealth. This is where the real structure shows up. The median Black household income is significantly lower than white households. Median Black household wealth is roughly 10 to 15% of white household wealth. And this gap is tied to historical exclusion from slavery, Jim Crow, and redlining, but also labor market segmentation and unequal access to capital and home ownership. So the Black American economy is consumption heavy, but asset light. And by 2024, the Black American economy had started to close the gap between whites and Blacks when it comes to amassing wealth. But since 2025, we have been regressing. And as far as labor and employment patterns are concerned, Black Americans are overrepresented in public sector jobs, but underrepresented in high capital, high ownership sectors, such as tech ownership, finance, and large-scale manufacturing. This matters because jobs generate income, obviously. Ownership, however, generates wealth and control, but public sector jobs have provided stability and powerful economic growth in the Black community. Black-owned businesses make up a small share of total U.S. businesses, but they are disproportionately smaller in scale, underfunded, and concentrated in service industries. They also have a limited access to capital and credit. A major structural issue often discussed about the Black American economy is spending patterns and circulation. Black consumer dollars tend to leave Black communities quickly, and we have lower rates of business ownership, as stated, banking access historically, and institutional control. This leads to weaker economic circulation, sometimes called the dollar staying power problem. The Black American economy is also shaped by systemic forces, not just individual behavior. For instance, housing policy, the redlining legacy is included in that, education funding disparities, criminal justice impacts on employment, and credit and lending discrimination. And these aren't abstract. They directly affect where people live, what jobs they can access, and whether they can build wealth. So what impact has recent legislation had on the Black American economy? And by recent legislation, I am speaking of the Big Beautiful Bill that was passed in July of 2025. Now, some will argue that these cuts that everyone's talking about coming from the Big Beautiful Bill are just fear-mongering. They're exaggerations or they are imaginary. But a lot of spending that happens when it comes to social welfare programs or education programs depends on how much of the money gathered from the federal government the state gives to a particular program. So the federal government gives block grants to the states for Medicaid, for Medicare, for education, for environmental projects, for justice system projects, law enforcement, et cetera, and the states decide how the money will be spent. They give it to local governments, and then local governments decide how the money that they receive from the state will be spent. The state sometimes doesn't give them all of the money that they're entitled to. And then when the local governments receive the money, they sometimes don't spend it all on its intended target. And I'm not talking about wasteful spending. I'm talking about willful withholding of funds, and also misappropriation of funds. So I'm not talking about, Doge, and they need to make cuts and they need to go fraud. And it's so many different factors that go into why programs do not receive the amount of money they're entitled to, but also why recipients are sometimes cut from these programs. It's not always the case that a person has too many income and resources for something such as Medicaid or Medicare or disability or unemployment or et cetera, or SNAP or TANF. Sometimes it's that the program does not have enough money to give to all of the people who need assistance. So they change the requirements. They change the income requirements. You may have qualified 6 months ago, but now you don't because the state did not receive as much money as they thought they were going to receive, or they don't have enough in their budget to support the number of people they could 6 months before. So when the Big Beautiful Bill comes in and says, okay, you're only going to get $60 billion for this. Here you guys go. Spend it as you see fit. Well, the state gets to decide who qualifies for Medicaid, and they do that based on how much money they receive. And Ohio, in response to the Big Beautiful Bill, actually is changing the number of recipients it will cover under Medicaid. So when people talk about cuts, they're actually talking about people being cut from the rolls. The requirements will change. The number of people eligible will change because the amount of money has changed. But also services covered will change. The government will no longer cover certain medications. They won't cover certain procedures. They won't allow you to see certain doctors or specialists. So yes, cuts will have to be made because the amount of money going to these programs has shifted. And by shifted, I mean decreased. The big, beautiful bill, or the big, ugly bill. The big, ugly, massive, cancerous tumor of a bill, rather. It's a sweeping tax and spending package, we know that extended and expanded earlier tax cuts. And it shifts benefits towards higher income households and businesses. The real question that I pose is, how does this hit the Black economy? Well, safety net cuts, for instance, lead to a direct hit to our economic stability. With these major cuts to Medicaid and SNAP and new work requirements, there will also be more frequent eligibility checks, reduced benefits and stricter access to these benefits, more rules so that they can have fewer people on these programs, because the aim is to not have these programs at all. And it's not just the federal government, it is also state and local governments too. They'd rather keep that money in their pockets. I know it sounds harsh, but it's the truth. It's the truth. And these programs that are being cut obviously disproportionately support lower income households, and Black Americans are overrepresented in those income brackets. And that's a structural reality, not a preference. And the consequence is less access to health care and food assistance, more income volatility, and higher risk of debt, eviction, and financial instability. There's also a macro effect. There's a projected 1.2 million job losses that will be tied to these cuts due to reduced spending in local economies. So yeah, think about that. SNAP benefits are cut, so you're not spending as much on food, right? You're not spending in your local economy as much. And if you have to spend more money on health care, on doctor's visits and medication, you're not spending as much. You're not going to the mall, you're not buying a car, not buying a new house maybe. You're going into debt. You probably have to declare bankruptcy. Also, there are tax changes with benefits that are skewed upward. There are permanent lower tax rates from the 2017 policy. There are new deductions, which we have heard are not permanent. They will expire, such as no tax on tips, no tax on overtime. And it expanded business tax breaks. So tax cuts obviously help the most when you have higher income, investments, and business ownership. And so the consequence from the big, beautiful, cancerous tumor act is higher income households gain more wealth, and lower income households see smaller or temporary gains. Multiple analyses of these tax changes conclude that this law redistributes income upward. And since Black households have lower median wealth, this widens the gap, even if everyone technically gets a tax cut. They also added a new crop of people to that work requirement. So if you had aged out of foster care, you didn't have to do that. You didn't have to have the work requirements. Now you have to. If you were a veteran, you didn't have to. Now you have to. And many people already work, but they work in unstable jobs. They do a lot of gig work, informal jobs, and caregiving roles are now no longer counted as work. So you can't be caring for an elderly relative and call that a job and have that job count towards the hours you have to spend in order to maintain SNAP or Medicaid. So again, we're looking at a loss of benefits without stable job replacement. This does not result in upward mobility, obviously, and it doesn't build a stronger Black economy. It raises the floor of survival without raising the ceiling of opportunity. There's also student debt and education changes. There have been cuts to or restructuring of student loan support programs. There has been reduced federal support for education systems thanks to this big cancerous act. I keep changing the name. And why does this matter? Because Black student loan borrowers carry disproportionately high student loan debt. And now, thanks to slower wealth accumulation or job loss, we're going to see delayed home ownership in the Black community. We're going to see reduced entrepreneurship capacity in the Black community. And while the act increased small business tax deductions, and that helps business owners, Black business ownership rates are lower, and access to capital remains a barrier. So while the benefit exists for small business owners, for entrepreneurs, it is not broadly distributed within the Black community. And the structural bottom line across independent analyses shows that the cuts hit low-income households the worst and the most. The gains flow to higher income households and capital owners, which all leads to greater inequality over time. And that inequality will come to bear for the Black community first and worst. The Black American economy is heavily reliant on wages and public sector jobs and consumption, and less anchored in capital ownership and wealth. That makes the effects of this bill particularly devastating for the Black economy because it reduces support at the bottom with the social safety nets and increases advantages at the top with tax policy changes and capital changes. And access to capital still being a barrier for Black entrepreneurs. So the likely outcome of this act is that there will be more financial strain in the Black community, with limited pathways to wealth building. Recessions of the past come out of oppression in labor, because this isn't the first time labor has been exploited in the history of the United States. This isn't the first time that corporations have exploited people in the United States. But the one way they were able to get out of it is by working together, is by communities coming together to fight the culprit, the main culprit. We, each other, the working class people, we are not the culprits, right? We keep reducing this to, oh, it's their fault. It's the Latinos' fault. They come here and they take our jobs. It's the Haitians' fault. It's the Jamaicans' fault. It's the Somalians' fault. They come here and they take our jobs. And frankly, that's lazy. Again, if you follow the thread all the way back, you don't land in our communities. You land in systems. You land in policies. You land in decisions that were made long before many of us were even born. This country built its hierarchy on race and class, deliberately, strategically, and over generations. You don't get centuries of inequality by accident. You get there through design. What is happening to the Black community is by design. And how we got here was through slavery, segregation, through policies like redlining that decided who could live where, who could build wealth, and who would be locked out. And so every time the presidency changes, our bite at the apple, our ability to bite at the apple changes. Our growth, our wealth growth changes. Either the gap widens for Blacks and whites, or it closes. And it was closing. The gap was closing. Blacks were building more wealth. We were closing the gap. It was still a gap in 2024. But in 2024, Black Americans showed an increase in wealth. And now we are regressing. We are regressing. Not because we're doing anything wrong, not because we're being lazy or not being intentional about growing our wealth. It's because we're losing money. We're losing jobs. We're losing money. We're losing our homes. We're losing our savings. We can't invest. This is what is happening. We're not able to put anything into the economy. We can't pay for school, higher education. This is what's happening. And then after all of this separation, inequality, inequities, after all of that, and after all of that systemic racism and inequality and inequities, the government forces Black Americans to fight immigrant groups for stability. We're fighting other groups for stability. We're being pitted against each other. That's not an accident. You're in arguments daily, weekly, politically with people whose economic position is almost identical to yours, right? Same debt pressure, same housing stress, same fragile job security. And yet you're treating each other like enemies. Why? Because if two groups of workers are busy fighting each other, they are not organizing. They are not negotiating. They are not building leverage. They are neutralized. That's not an accident. It's not an accident that Black Americans are being pitted against Latino Americans, especially in a fight for resources, and then being told that resources are scarce. The obvious question should be, who made those decisions? Who outsourced the jobs? Who suppressed the wages? Who weakened labor protections? But that's not usually where the conversation goes. Instead, it goes to those people, they're taking our jobs. Those people are the reason they're undercutting wages. Those people are draining our resources. And I hear this all the time on these TikTok lives. Nobody wants to talk about policy and power. They want to shift the conversation to people and identity. They've obviously been manipulated to think people and identity are the reason why the Black unemployment rate is so high. They're the reason why you can't find a house. They're the reason why there's a high crime. Right? It's insane. And it's not new. It's not new. This pattern shows up over and over in American history. In the 1800s, white workers were told Chinese laborers were the problem during railroad expansion. That culminates in the Chinese Exclusion Act, one of the first major laws to explicitly block a group based on ethnicity. In the early 20th century, Black workers were often used as strike breakers, not because they were the cause of labor conflict, but because employers exploited segregation to fracture solidarity. And you fast forward to today, and the script hasn't changed much. It's just been modernized. And sometimes the group changes too. Haitians, Jamaicans, Somalians, any kind of African, really, or even Indians. And it's just suddenly we're looking at people going, you're the reason why I don't have health care. You're the reason why I can't get food stamps. Everybody's getting food stamps but me. Everyone's getting health care but me. We've been pushed into this scarcity mindset and then told that some other group of people is the reason why we can't have the thing that we think we're entitled to. But also something else is happening. Unions are declining. The Trump administration is trying to weaken unions. Collective bargaining power is weakened in the federal government. It's being weakened elsewhere too. And at their strongest, labor movements forced people who didn't like each other to still fight for the same contract. And without that structure, division fills the vacuum. For many politicians, it's far easier to mobilize voters through identity-based grievances than through detailed economic reform. Blame is cheap. Structural change is hard, obviously, because they don't do it. Easy to blame, easy to hand out blame. Much harder to build people up. It's much harder to build structures that aid people, that keep communities together, right? What we're faced with, the Black recession, it's not going to be overcome by blaming immigrant groups. It's not going to be overcome by blaming Latinos. It's not going to be overcome by blaming undocumented workers. It's not going to be overcome by deporting anybody. It's not going to be overcome by blaming other groups of people based on their identity or country of origin. Again, If you trace the thread all the way back, it doesn't come back to our communities, does it? It comes back to the systems, to the corporations, to the government. So you take all of those changes and you combine them with what is happening with Black unemployment numbers being at 7.3%. We're looking at substantial economic losses, generational losses, without any safety net, without any relief in sight. And that if we don't do something about this right now, we will not recover as Black Americans from what is happening for anywhere from 40 to 50 years. Big, beautiful bill, act, whatever you call it, does not build a stronger self-sustaining Black economy. It largely reallocates resources in ways that make existing inequalities more pronounced. We are once again in the Black American community looking at mounting inequalities. We have not seen this since the 1970s. And we're facing these without a lot of the protections that we had in the 1970s. So let's stop playing games with branding. There's nothing beautiful about a law that pulls resources out of the bottom of the economy and hands structural advantage to the top, then pretends everyone benefits equally. In a country where inequality is already baked into the foundation, race-neutral policy with unequal starting points produces unequal outcomes every time. It cuts the floor out from under people who are already standing on unstable ground. When you slash Medicaid and SNAP, you're not trimming waste. You're removing healthcare, food stability, and economic shock absorbers from millions of people. And because Black Americans are disproportionately represented among lower-income households, which, by the way, is not by accident but by design of history, those cuts land harder, faster, and deeper. And here's the part that people perhaps don't want to say out loud because it makes them uncomfortable. The Black American economy is not fragile because people don't work hard. It's fragile because it is overexposed to wage income and underexposed to ownership. So when a law reduces safety nets, fails to expand ownership pathways, and rewards capital more than labor, it doesn't just miss Black Americans. It systematically squeezes them. Now let's look at the tax side. Yes, there are cuts. Yes, some people will see slightly bigger paychecks. But tax cuts are not neutral tools. They scale with what you already have. If you own assets, businesses, or large incomes, then tax cuts compound wealth. But if you're living paycheck to paycheck, they barely move your long-term trajectory. So what's really happening? We are watching a policy that amplifies capital and calls it growth while weakening the very systems that keep working-class people economically stable. And then we act surprised when inequality widens. Work requirements? Yeah, they've been around for a while. Let's talk about it. The narrative says this will push people into the workforce if we require them to work for SNAP and work for Medicaid. But that assumes that people aren't already working, and they are, sometimes 2 jobs. They are working, they're hustling, they're caregiving, or surviving in unstable labor conditions that don't fit neatly into bureaucratic definitions of employment. Oh, and by the way, caregiving now is no longer considered employment for SNAP and Medicaid. You can't be providing caregiving to an elderly relative and making an income and calling that the work that you do to maintain your benefits. So what is happening when we require people to work to maintain food assistance and health care and health insurance subsidies? People lose benefits faster than they gain stable income. That's not mobility, that's a grinding. And grinding is expensive financially, mentally, generationally. Now step back and look at the full picture. The black economy in America is driven by consumption without control. The money comes in and it goes right back out into rent, food, healthcare, transportation, often to systems not owned by the communities spending the money. So when you reduce incoming support and increase financial pressure, and you fail to build ownership infrastructure, you don't just slow the economy, you drain it. It reinforces a structure where black Americans remain a labor pool and a consumer base, but not a capital class. And without capital, there is no leverage. And this isn't about one party or one bill. This is about a pattern in the United States. Policies that ignore structural inequality don't produce neutrality. They reproduce hierarchy. And we know that the United States is a class hierarchy and is a race hierarchy that comes to bear for everyone except the white, wealthy class at the very tippy top. It stabilizes the top. The top still remains at the top. It just puts more pressure on the bottom. And then it calls that a balance. It calls that a win. Remember the pictures, the videos of the Republicans celebrating as Donald Trump signed that bill into law. That's not balance. That's not balance. And until policy starts addressing ownership, capital access, and structural barriers directly, every big bill, no matter how it's branded, will keep delivering the same result: a stronger economy on paper and a weaker position for the people carrying the most weight. And that is, right now, black Americans, because of the recession created by the Trump administration in our economy. Black America is in a recession. And if we don't say the thing, name the thing, we cannot fix it. So when you ask, are black Americans in a recession? When people say no, you tell them that that's not true. We absolutely are. There are two economies in America, and one of them is breaking. Black unemployment has been hovering around twice the rate of white unemployment, not slightly higher, but double. Now ask yourself something real. If the national unemployment rate suddenly jumped to 7 or 8%, what would we call that? We wouldn't call that resilient. We wouldn't call that cooling. We'd call it a recession. But when that same level of pain is concentrated in black communities, it gets renamed, rebranded, softened. It's called a disparity, a lag, a challenge. And it's none of those things. It's a contraction. It's loss. It's instability. It's a recession. If these numbers, these unemployment numbers showed up across the entire population, no economist would hesitate to call it a recession. And even though you're not supposed to call it that, you need to call it that. But it's not just about jobs. It's about home ownership. It's about public sector jobs. It's about black-owned businesses. It's about tax policy. It's about employment policy. It's about illegal firings, stagnating assets, the eroding stability. That's the definition of a recession. And it's not evenly distributed, but it is coming for every single one of us. And this has been Ayana Explains It All, brought to you by Facts, Figures, and Enlightenment. Take care.